Hi everyone, welcome to our first virtual lecture. I am your host, Sarah Wojciechowski, and we're going to start today with Chapter 15. A couple of quick side notes. At recording, I have one neighbor that is mowing their yard and another neighbor that is working on their boat. It is a big, like, cigarette type boat. Speedboat. So if you hear loud rumblings through the recording, that's what that is. Also, you see me down in the corner. I talk with my hands a lot, and it helps me to think. But I also know that when I go to conferences and things, that if I can't see the speaker and what they're saying, I get really distracted easily. So if I am a distraction to you, then just kind of slide your screen so you can't see me anymore. Otherwise, here we go. So let's hit this old slideshow from going. So we're going to start with Chapter 15, Reconstruction and the New South. And just to kind of keep in mind that our learning outcome here is, in what ways does the South change after the Civil War? And in what ways does it stay the same? So as we move through this lecture and as you move through your reading, you're going to want to keep that in mind, as this is what we're going to kind of center our discussions and our thinking about this around. So there are some problems with the peacemaking that happens after the war and during the emancipation process. One of the things that we need to make sure that we keep in mind that the South was pretty well ravaged after the Civil War. Railroad ties and lines were tore up. Telegraph lines were destroyed. Lines of communication were destroyed. Farmers' fields were destroyed. Whole swaths of towns and things. You probably already know about Sherman's March to the Sea and how that was just swath of devastation. So the South has to recover from that, and it's difficult for any country, or part of a country in this case, to recover from a war. That's something that you want to keep in mind as well as we move through this. The conditions for Southern blacks also changed as well. One of the things that is interesting that often gets overlooked is the number of slaves that were freed, essentially with the stroke of a pen, by the time it's all said and done. Not to discredit all the lives that were lost, but you've got 4 million freed slaves. And when you have that many people that are now free and they don't know what else to do, they're going to have to, kind of find their way in the world. Many of that 4 million left to find work. Many of them had nowhere to go, essentially. They had no property. They had essentially maybe the clothes on their back. That was it. They didn't have any tractors, or they didn't have tractors. They didn't have any farm equipment. They didn't have any, sort of the beasts of burden, horses, donkeys, cows, all that kind of thing. There's the boat, if you just heard it. So that's what that noise is. And they had nothing. They had no means of, selling property to move to different locations. They had no way of selling anything to buy property if they wanted to stay there. But a lot of them decided that they were going to leave to go find loved ones that they had been separated from because of the slave trade. And that was a key thing too. One of the things, if I can loop back to the devastated South, that's important to talk about is this idea of a lost cause. Many, many, many Southerners looked back sort of fondly, nostalgically, to the time period of the South before the Civil War happened. So the big sweeping plantations and, mint juleps and tea on the porch in the afternoon and stuff like that. They looked back at that fondly after the war was over, and that brought about a great sense of mourning for a lot of people. They were mourning the loss of basically a lifestyle that they had known their whole lives. So we have to stitch all of those things back together. And the country, if you think of the country as a piece of fabric. It's been ripped apart, and we have to figure out a way to stitch that together. So if you've ever, like, had to stitch something back up, you know, it's not perfect. You can't get the threads to go back exactly how they were. You can get them close, but it's not going to come back together in a way that exactly resembles what it was before. And I would venture to say that I think even in the North, they did not want the South to go back to how they were before. So one of the big things that, after reading this part of the chapter that I looked at, that I had circled in my notes, is Reconstruction became a struggle to define the meaning of freedom. What does it mean to be a free person living in this country? Is it just having the right to vote? Is it having the right of movement and the right of employment and the right of property and those types of things? What does all of those things mean? And newly freed slaves and whites in the North and whites in the South all saw that as different ways. So that brings us to our next part, which is the competing notions of freedom. Obviously, Black Americans wanted their independence. They wanted to make sure that everything was met and everything was moving accordingly. One of the biggest things that comes out of this is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau actually does quite a bit in improving the education of newly freed slaves, getting them to vote and things like that. So while the African Americans, there was the end of slavery, there was also this idea of rights and what type of rights would they be gaining. And so they gain, what are the rights that they gain and protections that they gain as a free man or a free woman? Some of them demanded redistribution of economic resources. Some people wanted more legal equality. Then you have some people that were kind of like in that center of the Venn diagram, the Venn diagram, that were wanting for both of them. The white Southerners, they wanted to, a lot of them wanted no interference by the federal government. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a federal government program. They didn't like the fact that it was in the South. Excuse me. So this notion, this idea of trying to navigate what is going to look like was something that was very difficult to overcome, as one would imagine. Like, you are completely re-establishing what life looks like, and some people wanted A and some people wanted B, and you have to find a way to make that happen. Not unlike what's going on right now with the coronavirus. How do we open up the economy again? You have groups of people that are like, let's just do it and come what may. And you've got other people that are like, no, let's wait to see what the science says. You've got another group that, you know, okay, let's do this in baby steps and do these things. So trying to get everybody on the same page was something that was challenging. So there were a couple of plans for Reconstruction. There was the Radical Republican plan, there was Lincoln's plan, and then there was the Wade-Davis bill. Lincoln really wanted to focus on just a rapid reunification. What do we need to do to get this country whole again? And that was his goal. He said that he wanted as few as 10% of Southern voters to pledge loyalty to the United States of America, because remember, they were the Confederate States of America, technically a different country. So if as few as 10% of the voters in 1860 agreed to loyalty to the United States, those states could immediately begin to set up a new state government. And there were lots of people that were quite upset about that. So then the other option is the Wade-Davis bill. The Wade-Davis bill authorized the president to appoint a provisional governor for each conquered state. So that provisional governor could very well have been someone from the North coming into the South to oversee the reestablishment of that state to the United States. In order for that to happen, a majority of white males had to pledge allegiance to the Union. They had, the governor then could summon a state constitutional convention so they could recraft their state constitutions. And then the delegates from that state would be selected, swear an oath never to bear arms against the Union. So, never bear arms, that they never bore arms against the Union. Lincoln was trying to figure out a way to bring together the Wade-Davis bill and the Reconstruction policy. If you're looking at me, I've been doing this with my hands a lot. This idea of bringing everything back together, finding, having a diplomatic response to all of this was something that was really, really important to Lincoln. He wanted everybody to come back into the fold. And then, as we know, Lincoln is assassinated. He's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth as he's watching a play in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is a image of Lincoln. This is the one that is in your textbook. The caption is the same caption as in your textbook. It's a haunting paragraph of Abraham Lincoln showing clearly the weariness and aging that 4 years as a war president had created. I think if you look at most presidents, their first image of them is usually the day that they're inaugurated, and then you look at them like at the end of either their 4 or their 8 years. They all look a whole lot older, like they've aged quite significantly. So, but yes, Lincoln was very weary from all of the wartime stuff that had been going on. So, Lincoln's assassinated. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes the president, as per the Constitution requires. And he wasn't the most ideal candidate to take up this torch, if you will. Johnson was openly hostile to the freed slaves. He didn't want to he didn't want to really extend many olive branches that way. And he kind of recrafted his vision for the country, not as Reconstruction, which, if you are reconstructing something, you are rebuilding it or making new. He labeled his as restoration, and that makes it sound like we're keeping some of the old and we're bringing in the new. So there's a little bit of kind of a give and take, a little bit of a play on words with what he wants to do. The folks in the North weren't too keen on this. Many of them did not like Johnson's stance towards the newly freed Black Americans, and they just didn't really like much of what he had going on. So he moves forward with this restoration plan. Well, hold on. Before we get to this next spot, I want you to take a second, maybe hit pause on the video, and kind of think about how, from what we have so far, how does the South change from pre-Civil War to now that we're in Reconstruction? So maybe take a moment, hit pause, kind of highlight in your notes or jot some things down. What have we talked about so far that would be helpful to answering that question? Either how the South changed or how didn't it change, if we want to go really grammarly inaccurate. So go ahead and pause, write some things down, and come on back. Okay, we're going to talk about radical Reconstruction. So we've got two things that come out with the radical Reconstruction. We've got the Black Codes, and then we've got the 14th Amendment. The Black Codes were written to give white Southerners substantial control over their former slaves. It authorized local officials to apprehend unemployed African Americans, find them for vagrancy, and then, in order to pay off, because they don't have any money, in order to pay off their fine, they would have to go work for a farmer to pay off that debt, or some other local employee. Maybe it's not a farmer, maybe it's a, you know, a factory worker, construction worker, things like that. So essentially what they do is they kind of they figure out a way to kind of wrap in essentially almost slavery again. There were instances of men, you know, at lunchtime, black men at lunchtime, walking to the grocery store to get supplies for lunch or for dinner. And they would be arrested for vagrancy because you should be working right now. And he's like, oh, it's on my lunch break, you know, but you should be working right now. So they would get wrapped up with that, and then away they would go. Some of the codes did not allow blacks to own or lease farms or take jobs other than jobs in the plantations or in domestic work. So this is really going to, you know, obviously diminish the amount of types of jobs that African Americans can occupy. While all this is happening, Congress does decide to extend the Freedmen's Bureau a little bit longer. The Freedmen's Bureau was only supposed to be around for like a year or two. It wasn't supposed to be a very long program. But what they decide is that they're going to move forward with that. In April of 1866, the first Civil Rights Act was passed. And this Civil Rights Act, as you can see here on the screen, declared that African American citizens of the U.S. That African Americans were citizens of the U.S. and that the federal government gave rights to intervene if state laws or policies violated those rights. So this is sort of the first step in this, and it is this Civil Rights Act, well, what would have been it. Johnson ends up vetoing it, but Congress overrode him. So it's this Civil Rights Act that is used as the basis for the civil rights movement that we see in the 1960s, along with some other things. But this notion that the civil rights movement was only around in the 1960s is like hogwash. Like, it's been going on essentially since Reconstruction. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 does become put into play. Then we get the 14th Amendment. And what the 14th Amendment does is it grants citizenship. It officially grants citizenship for African Americans, or people of, I guess, descent of African Americans. And that is where we're going to stop there. So, moving forward, there was a new set of legislative bills that were passed as part of this whole Reconstruction movement. So not only are we dealing with how are we going to stitch the nation back together, how are we going to deal with newly freed African Americans, but we're also going to, you know, throw in some other things as well, because, you know, why not? That's the fun thing to do. Whoops, sorry about that. Let's go back one. So Congress puts together or puts out a couple of bills right away. They wanted to make sure that you know, kind of everything was on the table. When those three bills came, Johnson vetoed all three of them, but then Congress overrode the other ones. The 15th Amendment was put on the table in order to and ratified in order to. I'm sorry. I should probably tell you what the 15th Amendment is. The 15th Amendment granted voting rights to any citizen. Or let me rephrase another way. Citizens could not be denied voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of employment. So race, color, or previous condition of employment. Notice how gender's not in there. So we have to wait till we get to the 1920s on that. But the government could have very well, put that one in there as well, but that wasn't what was the hot button issue at the time, unfortunately. So it won't be for almost 40, 80 years that we get the women's suffrage movement. So the 15th Amendment is put into the Constitution, and then the Tenure of Office Act was put on the president, was passed, and what it did was it limited presidential powers, because the Congress, they didn't really like Andrew Johnson, and they wanted to find some way of getting him out of there. So they ended up impeaching Andrew Johnson, but he ends up being acquitted. So he's impeached in the House, but the Senate acquits him. That was pretty much it. Like, that was the big news, the big scandal, all that fun stuff. That was where all that went out. So this is another map that is in your book. You can see in green is the Confederate former states. The date in black is the date that it was that state was readmitted into the Union. And then the date in orange is the date of the reestablishment of a conservative government. So what this is showing you is how quickly the conservative movement does come back and take over through what Southerners were liking to call redemption. All right, so this is going to be part 2, the South and Reconstruction. I'm going to stop the video here. We're going to start part 2 in just a moment. So don't go anywhere.